So, hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to our panel, which is called the IPCC Report Challenges, Climate Emergency and Climate Justice. I am Mariana Pavlovskaya. I am chair of the Department of Geography and Environmental Science at Hunter College of the City University of New York. My research focuses on geographies of diverse and solidarity economies in the United States and Russia. And I'm working right now with colleagues on a book which is called Solidarity Cities. And it is impossible to imagine such cities without them being sustainable. So first, let me thank those who helped us organize this event. I'm thanking Hunter College, of course, and President Raab, as well as the leadership and fantastic support team of the Roosevelt House. I'm thanking staff of the Department of Geography and Environmental Science at Hunter, and our department also is a sponsor of this event. I would like to start my remarks by acknowledging the devastating outcomes of all wars and express solidarity with all anti-war efforts. The climate emergency through which we are living now is another example of a catastrophe. In contrast to war, this catastrophe unfolds at a slow speed, but it is accelerating now. In fact, it went unnoticed for decades, and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and this is what the acronym IPCC stands for, was established by the United Nations and World Meteorological Organization only in 1988. Its charge is to provide policymakers with regular scientific assessments on the current state of knowledge about climate change. The IPCC produced 6 reports and 3 special reports. They have drawn attention to global warming as an international problem, set specific targets that the warming should not exceed 2 degrees centigrade, then 1.5 degrees centigrade, because we were not moving fast enough, right? But the conclusion of the last IPCC report, released earlier this year, is incredibly blunt. It makes it clear that climate emergency poses an existential threat to life and humanity. So I will introduce the panelists in order in which they will share their thoughts, and then we will move on to the discussion. So I just want to say that it is really my great pleasure to introduce this amazing group of experts, earth scientists and geographers. The 2 geographers on the panel, in fact, have contributed to the latest IPCC reports. It is amazing honor and recognition of our discipline. First, I am excited to introduce Dr. William Salecki, who is a professor at our Department of Geography and Environmental Science and an expert in urban environmental change, resilience, and adaptation. Salecki founded the Institute for Sustainable Cities at Hunter College, which works to make cities part of the solution to sustainability challenges. He was an author of the IPCC Working Group 2's summary for policymakers and chapters on climate risks decision-making, and has been coordinating lead author of the US National Climate Assessment chapter on urbanization, infrastructure, and vulnerability. It is honorable. The next panelist, and I'm so excited to introduce her, is Dr. Aideh Salmoun, who is an associate professor at our department, again, of Geography and Environmental Science. Her research focuses on processes at the atmosphere land-ocean interfaces and their interactions. Her recent work concerns processes in the planetary boundary layer, the lower layer of the atmosphere that connects the surface and atmosphere components of the Earth system and varies geographically, temporarily, and by scale, bridging Global Weather and Climate. She was an author of the 2021 NASA PBL Incubation Study Team report, Toward a Global Planetary Boundary Layer Observing System. It's an honor, Professor Salmoun. And finally, I'm so excited to have an external guest in our little departmental panel. And it is an amazing Dr. Kivon Rini, who is an associate professor in the Department of Geography at Rutgers University. Prior to joining the faculty at Rutgers, he held a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Oxford and taught for several years at the University of the West Indies in Jamaica. His research explores the developmental and justice implications of global environmental change for coupled natural and human systems in the Caribbean, with a particular focus on the ways in which ensuing socio-ecological stresses and shocks, ranging from extreme weather events and new plant diseases to displaced livelihoods, are unevenly experienced. Kivon is the development section editor for Geography Compass, which is a very important journal in our discipline, and serves on the editorial boards for Political Geography and the Royal Geographical Society Institute of British Geographers Wiley book series. He also served as a contributing author for the IPCC special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees centigrade. It's extreme honor, Kivon, to have you here. Thank you for joining us. And thank you all for being part of this panel. So the questions that the panelists will address are the following, okay? So if you are familiar with the report, you will know that it allows for a short window for action. How short, in your opinion, in terms of consequences of the inaction? What kinds of climate emergencies are we going to see? The report also pays large attention, and this is relatively new, to the uneven impact of climate emergencies on different countries and populations, in the global south in particular. How important it is for the global north to understand and take into account this problem. Can global north survive by caring only about itself? What would it take, in your opinion, to implement the IPCC demands for action and equity? Who, besides the climate scientists studying the impending changes, should be involved in order for societies to take action? So the discussion will proceed along those lines, and the format of the panel will be as follows. So the panelists will speak each for about 10 minutes, and then we will move to the discussion. I ask audience members to please submit questions through the Q&A function of the Zoom, and myself and panelists themselves also will take those questions and we will answer them, okay, as we get them. So I think we are ready to go. Okay, so now over to Bill Salecki. Bill, please.
Great. Thanks, Mariana. So I'm going to bring up my slides and then have a little bit of a conversation regarding some of the issues from the questions that were raised. I'll try to, I'll set my little timer here. I think I'll set my timer.
I can do it for you.
All right, thank you. Very good. So as was mentioned, I was involved in this final report. In fact, all the summary for policymakers, and I hope I can talk to some of that in the Q&A. But what I want to do now is just talk a little bit about some of the highlights in the report specific to the questions that were raised at the outset. So it is this issue of you know, the evidence, the building evidence that's quite clear of the potential threat, and that that you know, action is needed. And I think one of the key things to recognize is this idea of opportunity. The report also highlights there are opportunities, and I think we're starting to get a better understanding about where those opportunities lie for action. And I think, embedded in that is the question of justice and inclusiveness and equity as well. So I think we'll see through some of these presentations, through my presentation and some of these slides, how this will drape out over the course of the next decade, hopefully, right? But of course, there are these threats that are upon us. There is a range of different sort of risks that are presented in the report. I don't want to go too much into this. There's a lot of material, but of course, there's a question of heat, extreme heat, impacts on agricultural production, to quality of life in cities, water scarcity, which is a huge question in a range of different domains. Of course, both of those, the water scarcity and the heat, translate into questions of food security, agricultural productivity declines, and then, of course, flood risks are another sort of major question. There are many, many others certainly out there, but these are things that are highlighted. And I know that maybe Keyvan, I think, will pick up some of that issue with respect to small island states, critical importance. I think the other thing the report starts to do is really stretch out the discussion a little bit more about how climate change connects to other phenomena. And I think one of the things, if you're interested in the social science questions, they really have come to the fore in the discussion. And the recognition that climate change really has its impacts and the solutions have to be embedded in this sort of larger context of how we use our natural resources, habitat destruction, the process of growing urbanization, and embedded inequity within that. So, these are sort of, the fundamental ways of looking at climate change, not just a singular thing, but connected more broadly. Another big finding from the report is that while adaptation has begun, and this is the report particularly focusing on this rather than mitigation, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, it's very little has actually been done yet, and very little, even less of that has been evaluated in terms of its potential impact. I think one of the things, the other sort of threads that is important for us to recognize, that cities really play an oversized role in this. We live in an urban world. Much of the human population growth that we'll see, up to 2050 is going to be in small and medium-sized cities, particularly in low and moderate income countries. And so we're going through this sort of major process of urbanization now, and we can integrate, lots of innovative technology and new approaches, particularly nature-based and other engineering approaches, but particularly incorporating nature-based approaches into the building of these new cities, as well as the rebuilding of cities like the city of New York, recognizing that it's continually being rebuilt, and that there are many sort of wider benefits that we'll see as part of that. The report also really kind of pushes the envelope and asks the question, how can we start to accelerate adaptation? We recognize that human populations are vulnerable, that there are impacts, but what does the science say about adaptation? And here the report really comes up some really strong results. How do we accelerate this process? Well, we can enhance political commitment and follow through at all levels of government. The development of a clear institutional framework that provides goals and priorities and responsibilities. Enhancing knowledge of impacts and risks, improves responses, and monitoring and evaluation of these adaptation measures are really essential. And then most fundamentally, a focus on equity and justice. So I think it's one thing I want to say, this is not just sort of good government or good ways of doing things. There's a lot of evidence now available recognizing that adaptation to work well needs to incorporate these things. So it's not just sort of a feel-good approach, but it's really, clear evidence of how adaptation can work effectively. And this is really much present in the context of equity and justice. It was highlighted in the initial questions that this is a big issue. This is not just a moral question or a position to take, but it really is a recentering around the issue of equity and justice into the process of adaptation practice, because there's clear evidence that if you want these things to be effective, if you want adaptation to be meaningful and to be deeply rooted within communities and nations, the process has to be inclusive, transparent, and co-generative. I mean, these are some of the fundamental findings from the report, and that how to promote this through one, addressing the limits to adaptation, things that are preventing adaptation from taking place, promoting enabling conditions, particularly enhancing governance capacity, enhancing financing, enhancing knowledge development and transfer, and then building an adaptation process that's very flexible and adjusts over time. And one of the key things that also came out of the report was this notion of maladaptation. So a lot of things are being attempted and tried with respect to adaptation, but in some cases they're not the right decision. They lead to situations, they lock us into sort of specific answers, and in fact are not flexible for the future. The nature-based solutions, which we see highlighted on the right here, are much more sort of flexible and can be adjusted as our understanding of the science and as the risk profiles change. So there's a lot to be spoken here on this question of maladaptation and how to avoid it. The last thing I'll say, and I'm sensitive to time, is this issue that it's embedding climate change in this larger development process. And one of the things that sort of came out is that, of course, adaptation is necessary, but also we need to connect it to greenhouse gas mitigation. And in fact, the follow-on report, Working Group 3 report, highlighted not just the next decade and answering the question here, like what's the time frame for action. The Working Group 2 report on adaptation said the next decade, which means today plus 10 years. The Working Group 3 report basically said we need to act now. We have years in which we can put forward effective action. So it's the time scales get even more compressed. But the critical notion here is to link adaptation and mitigation. And one of the ways that the report highlights, particularly the Working Group 2 report, is the promotion of this sort of broader framework called climate resilient development that attempts to sort of integrate adaptation and mitigation of greenhouse gas reduction in the context of development for sustainable development for all. And in terms of like who needs to be involved, the report speaks to this needs to be at all levels of government, including civil society, and critical sort of part of this puzzle is creating partnerships and learning experiences to sort of bring forward these multifaceted solutions across all these different domains. And then in terms of what the solutions framework needs to do, it has to involve these marginalized groups, because again, the issue of equity becomes central to the question and justice. We need to focus on the distributional issues of equity, procedural as well as recognitional equity in terms of who has the right to actually sit into these discussions, and how are the different groups who are involved in this process recognized. Has to reconcile and work on reconciling different interest values and worldviews. Huge tasks, but the recognition is that if we can embed these kind of conversations in larger questions of sustainable development, this potentially could be a win-win situation in this moment of opportunity. Lots of challenges ahead, certainly. And as we look into the future, what was described as these pathways to CRD, and the recognition that we've in some ways already passed some thresholds. So we've already missed some opportunities, and that we're at this sort of hinge point where, depending on the decisions that are made over this next decade, we could start to be moving toward enhanced opportunities for climate resilient development, or potentially sort of moving in a path where our capacity to respond to future shocks, future pressures, and increased sort of inequities becomes more and more difficult to do. So this is sort of the notion of this pathway. It also connects in some ways to the climate sustainable development goals that have been defined by the UN and others, and how to enhance that. And obviously, as we move toward the green, we get more of these sustainable development goals. So I think that's all I'll have to say, sort of kind of introducing the report, and particularly germane to, I tried to make it germane to the questions that were raised. And fundamentally, equity and justice are central. I'll kind of highlight that a little bit more maybe in the Q&A, but thanks.
Thank you, Bill, so much for this kind of broad but yet focused introduction in highlighting the issues that are specific to this report and are also important for addressing climate emergency. So our next panelist is Professor Aideh Salmoun.
Thank you, Mariana. Let me share my screen here. I think I have a collection of eclectic thoughts and observations that I'll share with you. I come to all of this climate issues from several perspectives. One is that I'm a scientist. I'm a physical scientist. I'm a geoscientist. And some of what informs many of the findings comes from model results, observations, and process understanding. My hope is that my studies in processes contribute to some of all of this very important science that has so much to do with what with our lives, with human lives. I thought I'll take you for a moment to the work group 1, the IPCC report that was based on the physical basis, the physical science of climate. Just to give some context to all of this, this is actually the basis for what the report 2 that Bill brilliantly summarized. All of this science is being used in some of their findings. But I'd like to state that back in August of 2021, it was unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean, and land. Widespread rapid ranges in the atmosphere, ocean, and cryosphere and biosphere, basically on Earth, have already occurred. The scale of recent changes across the climate system as a whole and the present state of many aspects of the climate system are unprecedented over many centuries, too many years. And finally, the third big one that some of the underlining are mine. Human-induced climate change is already affecting many weather and climate extremes in every region across the globe. Evidence of observed changes in extremes such as heat waves, precipitation, droughts, tropical cyclones, etc. In particular, their attribution to human influence has strengthened since the 5th assessment, namely, the 5th assessment was released in 2013, nearly a decade ago. I just can't help but notice that we already knew quite a bit then. So let me move, we're not going to talk about this report. Let's move on to the present. As I said, much of the projections used in this report, some of the technicalities are that they use the so-called coupled model intercomparison project phase 5 and 6. And those have a long tradition of development and improvement. These are extremely large effort. They include models from the top models from many, many countries, several from each country. So as a scientist, and I think I'm talking about all of us are scientists here in some form or another, we should have a lot of trust in what they tell us. I'm gratified by the move that the IPCC has evolved to think that the science alone cannot, the physical science alone cannot do it. And Bill mentioned that. So in projections, in these model studies, not only the concentrations and the emissions are considered, but they also consider in their analysis the so-called shared socioeconomic pathway scenarios. That, as a physical scientist, that always thought that science is being done by people. It's a very rewarding move for me. And so one of the things that I wanted to stress, I need to be also cognizant of time. I just wanted to take one figure some focus on some aspects of what really struck me the first time I opened this document. Some of the specific contents of this document that Bill reviewed so well, presented so well. The impact of climate change are observed in many ecosystems and human systems worldwide. Okay, this is a little bit of a busy thing. Please focus on high or very high. The darker color, so what do we have on all the ecosystems, land, terrestrial, freshwater, ocean, species, so we have impacts on ecosystem, species range, changes in timing, etc. And you can tell that globally, the confidence in the attribution to climate change is extremely high. And when this bunch of scientists say extremely high, we're talking about confidence intervals that probably range on the 95 to 99% and probability. It's almost certainty. And we also see in here all the regions of the world where these impacts will and are already being felt. So I would invite you to go to these pictures and these figures and just think about them. Just think about them. And here, look at the small island, which is something that Kevon will probably focus on. The next figure also is something that called my attention because these are the observed impacts of climate change on human systems. And if we look at this, well, minus means, sorry, I should tell you that minus mean increased adverse effect, plus would mean increase non-adverse effect, but as you can tell, we only have some combinations of pluses and minuses. That basically means that in that particular region, there will be places where the negative impacts, and there will also be positive impacts in the same region. And then the colors correspond to the same colors that I showed before. High, very dark blue is high or very high, and then medium. Medium is quite high for the assessment that these scientists make. So let's not say that there are some places where we have some lows, but for the most part, even if you just look at it for a moment, it's all blue or little purple. It's all high or very high. So I can tell you other things, but I just thought this is something I put together, a little bit of this that I put together yesterday for a class of mine. I started talking about climate change and climate change. And I pondered, I copied this from a colleague of mine, part of it, Frank Bonaiuto. And I was thinking, well, if you live in the bubble and you have the luxury of redacting some of these reports, indeed, have a nice day. However, you go and tell these people in these figures that really global warming is not a big deal. Another thing that this report stresses is, but all of these reports now do, is talk about the medium, near term, medium term, and far term of the next century. So the medium, the near term is the range of years 2021 to 2040. And I want to focus for a moment on that. Well, the year 2100 seems far away. Okay, you know, I certainly wouldn't be here, but I cannot think about that. Okay, what about thinking about the year 2040? That's just around the corner. The children and youth of today, yours, mine, will be full-fledged adults, some possibly in their productive 50s. their children will be youth. They will be what, 20, 30 years old then, and just starting to establish their path to careers, jobs, and family. So I would like to say to the youth of today is you can afford to be selfish and think, what is my world in 20 years? Some of us, we cannot afford to be selfish. We have to think about all of this. So there is no longer time to think. And when I say think, I mean think and ponder and debate and argue whether climate is really changing or not, or can be attributed to this or that. I think we have the information. And when I thought about that, something else came to mind. And I thought, well, what I'm thinking is put a face to this. Okay, I'm thinking about these people, the little kid in here, a member of my family, these young students at Hunter that, came to see parts of the world, another bunch of people that sometimes we take out there to the Palisade with the help of our dear Peter Mapp, who is here in the picture also. This is a little piece of farm that, well, it's home for me. And I ask the youth of today, will you be able to enjoy a little piece of this garden, for example? So I ranged from my science to a very personal stand, but I am a person, and I don't come to this for if any time in my life I thought, well, I like physics because, it's something that it's not involved with human issues and opinions and the like. We don't have that luxury anymore. We really don't. Thank you so much.
Ade, thank you so much for incredible translation of scientific facts into human experiences, and not just abstract human experiences in general, but I think while you were speaking, every single person could really start imagining how it would concern them in particular and their loved ones. So I would say this is also some kind of, the feminist approach to those issues. So it is not science per se, or not, let me just say, not only science, but it is also care, right? It is also care about the consequences, care about the world, about the people at all scales, and our loved ones as well. So thank you so much. Now, esteemed Dr. Irini, please, it is your turn. Go ahead, Kemal.
Thanks, Marianne. I'm going to pull up my presentation. And of course, this is just to help me to organize my thoughts, and very mindful of the time. So I'm just going to try to get to some of the main points. So again, just thanks for inviting me to be part of this conversation. I'm looking forward to the Q&A section as well. I think my talk builds well on the two presentations before, which is like, in a way, Bill kind of helped to set the context to what some of the main points coming out of this report, and really kind of highlighting to some extent, that this report is an important milestone because of several of the key points that were raised around equity and justice. And this is something that Mariana mentioned and Heidi also pointed out too, in terms of even thinking about intergenerational justice. And so I want to kind of reflect on the implications of the assessment report from the perspective of SIDS in general, particularly thinking about Caribbean small island developing states here. And of course, this is informed by, I guess, my own kind of background and research interests, having worked in the Caribbean for the past 15 or so years, and also being a native of Jamaica. And my reflection is therefore kind of informed by my own kind of embodied experience, but also, kind of close reading of the report and kind of other kind of reports and studies that have emerged, especially since AR5, right? And the first thing I'd like to point out is that SIDS represent a unique case with regards to climate change, right? And the conclusions reached in the recently published AR6 report has huge implications for the future of SIDS in general. And so despite their diversity, small island developing states have long been recognized as being particularly at risk to climate change, and are recognized by the UN as a special group, given their shared and disproportionate vulnerability to climate change impacts. Internationally, SIDS are a group of 38 United Nations member states and 20 non-UN member or associate members that are located in 3 regions, the Caribbean, the Pacific, and AIMS, which is the Atlantic, Indian Ocean, Mediterranean, and South China seas, and are home to approximately 65 million people. So really representing a small fraction of the global population. And while there are significant differences in geographic size and governance systems, economic development, and so on, these nations share numerous features that place them at risk to climate change, including, narrow resource bases, small geographic size, a heavy concentration along coastal zones, which place them at risk of sea level rise, dominance of economic sectors that are heavily reliant on the natural environment and ecosystem services, physical remoteness in some cases, and limited economies of scale, right? So I think these kind of characteristics render many small island developing states as extremely vulnerable to climate change. And it's also important to point out that SIDS contribute only a negligible amount to global greenhouse gas emissions, which kind of speaks to the justice issue here. So it should come as no surprise then that SIDS and the SIDS community has been quite vocal in calling for attention to the challenges faced from climate change. And SIDS have been at the forefront of advocating for greater international ambition for limiting global warming. One of the most, contentious issues currently relates to future emissions reduction targets, which has seen the SIDS community advocating for a cap of 1.5 degrees Celsius on additional global warming above pre-industrial levels. We saw this with the 1.5 to Stay Alive campaign that was initiated by the Alliance of Small Island States, AOSIS, which was one of the main driving forces behind including 1.5 as part of the global temperature goal in the 2015 Paris Agreement, and also supported the request for the IPCC to produce a special report on the implications of 1.5 global warming. Despite these milestones, with seeing the SR 1.5 report coming out, seeing the IPCC and the AR6 pushing for, more ambitious targets in terms of future global warming, many uncertainties remain as to the extent of nation states' commitment to the obligations embedded in this historic climate agreement, right? It's a non-binding agreement. That is something that is extremely important to point out. And whether the mechanisms kind of set out under the final Paris Agreement are even sufficient to keep global warming to tolerable levels is still in question. And so implicit in, we look at these projections, however, is a realization that some future impacts are inevitable, right, in terms of the kind of broad arguments that are happening. And what we're seeing here from this is a diagram that I took from the AR6. This is coming from Working Group 1, Physical Science Spaces. It's a very interesting finding because I want to take this as a kind of a departure to think briefly around its implications for Caribbean SIDS. And what we're thinking about in terms of the 1.5C target is what many Caribbean leaders frame as a kind of an existential threat, right? They're saying that at the current level, of which is around 0.8 to 1 degree Celsius, when we compare to pre-industrial levels, you're already seeing massive changes in ecosystems, sea level rise. We're seeing major hurricanes that's impacting the region. And even though there's no clear a correlation between hurricane frequency and global warming, there is quite a strong consensus that future warming will lead to more and more stronger hurricanes. And for the Caribbean, as we've seen in the last few decades, particularly since the 1990s, we've seen this major uptick in Atlantic hurricane cyclone activities. This is expected to continue over the next coming decades, which has severe implications for the region as a whole. So I want to use this as a kind of a point of departure to think about the implications of this diagram for SIDS. And what you're seeing here from this diagram is that in terms of all of the scenarios would suggest there is an overshoot above 1.5C, right? So there's a greater than 50% likelihood that global warming will reach or exceed 1.5C degrees Celsius in the near term. And this is thinking with Haiti in terms of, it's not end of century we're talking about the next couple of decades from now. And at the same time, while this is showing that, I also want to point out that the very low greenhouse gas emission scenario, while it shows a temporary overshoot of no more than around 0.1 degrees Celsius above that 1.5C target, it is expected to decline back to below 1.5C toward the end of century. So I think it's important to bear that in mind as we're kind of thinking about these implications. What is quite clear is that all of these other scenarios work against the agenda of SIDS. The closest and the only scenario that works close enough to what the SIDS community is arguing for would be the SSP1 to 1.9 scenario, which is a very interesting thing to think about in terms of what would be business as usual, because there's still a big debate in terms of which one of these scenarios would represent business as usual. So of course, this finding has significant material implications for the Caribbean and SIDS in general. I think the consequences are far-reaching and complex. For the Caribbean, the main threats relate to the impacts from extreme weather events, particularly hurricanes, floods, and droughts, and increasingly, wildfires, particularly in places like Jamaica. And of course, sea level rise, which is a major threat for the region. So droughts have only been have been particularly damaging to the region, particularly in terms of the agricultural sector. I don't have the time to kind of go into that, but I guess the big point I'm trying to make is for the region, it's not just one, the concern isn't with a single hazard event. I mean, what we've seen in the last few years to decades is that the Caribbean has been the site of multiple and cascading shocks, climate-induced shocks and stresses. The 2017 hurricane season marked a very important moment, right? We saw up to 3 to 4 massive hurricanes impacting the region. And that also speaks to a lot of developmental issues as well, right? The 2017 hurricane season being the costliest on record with an estimated damage of at least $294 billion. That alone, and it's very important to understand that when a hurricane hits a small island developing state, that can set that state back by multiple years in terms of their development trajectory, right? In the case of, I think it was Hurricane Ivan, Grenada's impact, 90% of its agricultural sector was wiped out. That was equivalent to 140% of its GDP. So that's massive. One hurricane can impact an entire small island developing state and can set back that small island developing states by several years, which has serious implications for us meeting our sustainable development targets, serious implications for poverty alleviation, freshwater resource, our water security, food security, and so on. So this is like really an important point to note. And when we think about rising sea levels, this also poses a real and an imminent threat for a region characterized by small low-lying states and territories. And to just put the situation in context, several Caribbean islands are already at the tipping point in terms of water insecurity. Barbados, for instance, given its lack of freshwater resources, there's no running surface water in Barbados, right? It's a limestone coral island. It relies almost exclusively on groundwater aquifers and rainwater storage. It has a water availability of just 306 cubic meters per capita per year, which makes it the 15th most water scarce nation in the world. Jamaica has suffered from an aging and overburdened water system with tens of thousands of reported leaks per year. And in Dominica, water service was not restored to many areas until mid-2018, which was more than half a year after Hurricane Maria devastated that island. So these are individual examples, but the issues are representative of the region as a whole, right? In fact, most water utilities in the Caribbean record non-revenue water levels of over 40%, meaning they're losing that water from their existing systems. And in some cases, like St. Kitts and Nevis, non-revenue water losses can be as high as 75%. So what the climate change is doing is adding and compounding the existing development challenges in many of these islands, right? And I think this is something that the report speaks to in a very kind of real and effective way. And so the last thing I'll say here, again, I'm mindful of the time, I would like to kind of close by considering the report's call for climate resilient development that accounts for questions of equity and social and climate justice. Now, again, the point is that the Caribbean is a perfect example of the injustices of climate change. It's a region that contributes a small amount to greenhouse gas emissions, but is one of the most vulnerable regions to climate change and has limited capacity in many cases to adapt to future climate change impacts. The report also makes clear that climate resilient development pathways are progressively constrained by every increment of warming, in particular beyond 1.5C. And I think that's something I probably want to talk about more in the Q&A. And I think this aligns strongly with the agenda of SIDS and the growing recognition of the limited progress made in international climate negotiations and climate financing to date. Although there have been some recognizable advancements in global climate negotiations around notions of climate justice, especially in terms of the inclusion of common but differential responsibilities within UNFCCC, CCC, and so on. We still have a lot of resistance from the global north in terms of loss and damage. There is still a lot of work to be done in terms of understanding precisely what justice looks like within climate financing. And really focusing on marginalized groups and thinking about how maladaptation can make situations worse. And again, just thinking here with Bill in terms of his example of fixed versus kind of, more flexible forms of adaptations is something that we want to kind of bear in mind. All right, I'm going to stop there because I'm mindful of time, but I'm kind of looking forward to the Q&A, and thanks again for inviting me. Looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rini. That was an incredible depth of the insight into how close we are to threshold, which, the place of no return. And I'm really appreciate that you showing us those graphs and explaining, the situation at which we are now. And also another thought that I had when listening to your presentation is that everything you discussed about the SIDS seems like a microcosm of what is going to happen down the line to all these other countries. And this makes me think to the graphs that Aidee was showing, right? North America, for example, is already with high certainty is experiencing all these changes. So those connections seem to be just so vital for understanding and for building solidarity among different parts of the world and different groups in order to proceed forward. So thank you so much, Keyvon. I'm gonna turn now to Q&A. We have one question, and guess from whom? From Ben Rubin. Very good. So the question is for Professor Reilly.
Yeah.
Is there a different politics of climate in SEEDS countries that are oil gas export dependent, Trinidad and Tobago, Seychelles, etc.? Are there any other material or political forces that create any significant differences within SEEDS nations in their positions, demands around climate and what is GG?
Greenhouse gas emissions.
Greenhouse gas emissions. There you go.
Right.
And Ben is a PhD student at the Graduate Center. So just like
Nice. Yeah, thanks for that question, Ben. Yes, that's an interesting question because I think David Hughes from Rutgers I think he published a book a few years ago on this, reflecting on the kind of contradictions between. He was really kind of focused on Trinidad in terms of thinking about its identity as a small island state, but at the same time, an oil-producing country. I think for the most part, there has been some form of tension there, but in general, especially regarding Trinidad's own sort of vulnerability to sea level rise, there's been, particularly in recent years, a growing interest in thinking about ways in which Trinidad can transition towards more kind of sustainable sources of energy. But there is in Trinidad's case, a strong sort of local interest group that connects back to British Petroleum and so on, right? It's actually a global interest there as well. In maintaining that status quo. And so there's a tension there in terms of their own domestic politics. But when you think about the kind of SEEDS agenda, one of the things I pointed out at first is that, it's quite diverse in terms of thinking through SEEDS as a category. And that has always been a kind of a lot of debate about who should be involved in SEEDS, who should be included, who shouldn't be included. But generally speaking, once you start to think about Trinidad's kind of identity as a SEEDS country, I would say that while it's a very complex kind of thing to think through, but for the most part, they've been supportive of the regional efforts, even though they have sort of like these domestic tensions. And I guess it's one thing to realize how complex reality is, right? That you can have these like contradicting positions, but at the same time, with sea level rise, places like even Tobago, because remember that Trinidad is a twin island state. Tobago, for instance, that relies primarily on tourism, have a kind of a different politics as well too there. So just to answer your question, because I think I'm going to beat you around the bush and not really answering it, it's actually quite complex, especially given what you're seeing with Guyana now, that is kind of shifting towards being an oil state as well too, right, with the new discovery that they've found. And those, I would say, are kind of outliers in terms of the broader SEEDS community, because in general, SEEDS are not oil producing countries. And for the most part, like Trinidad is really exports a small proportion of oil globally, right? Even though it's extremely significant for its economy.
Thanks, Keyvon. We have a follow-up on that from Joy Citrin, who is also a PhD student at the Graduate Center. From a political point of view, is the small islands developing states looking to increase their membership and thus their political clout? For example, their mainland members such as Guyana and Suriname.
Right. I mean, I think, I don't know if they're, I mean, yes, you know, your farm SIDS have a unique designation by the UN, which means that if you're designated as a small island developing states, you can attract funding for adaptation and mitigation projects. So there is a material benefit to being labeled as a SID nation. At the same time, even though Guyana and Suriname are not island states, they have many characteristics of islands, right? Like in the case of Guyana, for instance, Guyana is a mainland country within South America, right? However, 90% of Guyana's population live within a few kilometers from the coast, right? And the bulk of the country is actually part of the Amazon, but most of its population reside along its coast, which is low-lying. It's actually below sea level. A good portion of Guyana is below sea level. And they actually have many characteristics of other small island developing states. So even though it is not an island state, it has the characteristics that are very much kind of similar to small island developing states, which is part of the reason why, you know, they are arguing to be part of that designation. I think they're actually considered SIDS actually. But that's the main reason for that. And bear in mind that also there is another type of wide diversity for SIDS in terms of their political status, right? So there are SIDS that are independent states, there are SIDS that are territories. And if you think about Martinique, for instance, that and Saint Martin, they're both like Martinique is part of France. Saint Martin is part of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. And so there are kind of implications in terms of their ability to represent themselves internationally as well. So there are, you know, SIDS as a category itself is highly diverse, but one of the things, many things I think that connects these countries is their disproportionate vulnerability to climate change, which is shaped by the kind of characteristics that I spoke about: small size, heavy dependence on coastal lands, small economies of scale, and so on.
Thanks, Kimon. Bill, would you like to add something to it?
Just a very quick addition. You know, in the approval process of these reports, the summary for policymakers, every line has to be reviewed by delegates representing as many countries as want to be there. So it's a very laborious process. You go line by line. It has to be approved, full consensus, right? All countries have to approve. So the small island states, developing states, are like probably the most effective block, you know, collective group in those negotiations and approval process. And I just experienced it a couple of months ago. They will, you know, stick to every issue that is relevant. And in some ways they become like sort of the moral voice of the process, because they bring up the issues, the most difficult issues, the loss and damage, the equity considerations, the existential threat. It's very, very impressive to see them, to Kivon's point, work collectively, recognizing their differences, but they were echoing each other and consistently sort of hammering the case. So very effective.
Thanks, Bill. That is very interesting. I'm moving to the next question, and it is from Ramiro Campos, who is our adjunct instructor in our department. Ramiro is asking, I'm wondering if any of you on the panel secretly fear that the success of the Montreal Protocol lead us down this path of assuming that there would be continued cooperation within a Westphalian system built upon and still controlled by former colonial powers. Are we perhaps aiming at too large a scale and should focus on city networks and even smaller scales where SIDS can benefit? In other words, Is it easy for nation states to fail humanity? Perhaps this report should aim elsewhere. Bill, go ahead.
I'll just very quickly, I mean, it's clear evidence that nation states have failed to date. And, in their absence, described as subnational groups have really, they were embedded in the Paris Agreement as a category and have grown in strength over these past 7 years and continue to grow in strength, and particularly at the city level or other, subnational levels. So I would agree. And, at some, I mean, there's a larger question, that you're of course asking, will this process fail? And I remain cautiously optimistic, but sometimes seeing it close, I get very pessimistic with respect to the nation state. And I think you need other actors to engage, either to push the nation state or to fill the gap.
Thanks, Bill. Aide, Yvonne, would you like to add something?
I mean, I could say
Sure,
a few.
go ahead.
Okay, I mean,
Yvonne
I
and
guess,
then Aide.
right, just really building on what Bill's point on in terms of thinking about change at the subnational level. I think that's important. We've seen that in terms of the ways in which even New York, if you think about the nation state also blurs the kind of processes and innovations that take place below the level of the nation state. And, cities like New York, for instance, have been at the forefront of thinking through ways of making city environments sustainable, despite the fact that the United States at the kind of nation state level is a major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. You're still initiatives within the US at the subnational level where you see really promising initiatives taking place. Having said that, I still think there's a place for nation states, and I still think we have to hold the nation state accountable, particularly with this kind of new right-wing kind of populist kind of trend that you're seeing, where there's like a big pushback on science. And we've seen where sometimes scientific research can get compromised by these like state-led policies. And so it's very kind of important, I think, to kind of hold that tension where it's not one versus the other, but kind of really thinking about ways in which, this thing about adaptation and mitigation, as we're thinking about this, occurs at multiple scales, and they all kind of interconnect in a kind of a sense of like, it gives you this ecology that one has to kind of think through in a very kind of a scalar, complex and multidimensional way.
Thank you, Aide.
Just reflecting on what I hear, first of all, I was wondering whether the apparently well-organized and loud voices of these regions can be put together because of the size of the places, okay? So I was wondering about that. Maybe you can comment on that, but I do think that you can't, I mean, sometimes in these conversations, I feel like we end up putting the entire responsibility of change on those that actually are less, have less resources, those that are more vulnerable, those that these inequalities that climate change is going to lead to will be more affected by. And so I think efforts have to be focused on the global north, changes in the global north, which, as I tried to point out, had we been able to put more resources in alternative forms of energy, for example, then we wouldn't be now trying to disappoint me as a voter and many voters of this government by going back to drilling oil from the ground. I understand the situation, but this short vision for things, we can't afford this. Have these changes happened with the first assessments or the previous assessment when we already had enough information? And the resistance to change I don't think comes from the South. I think it comes from the North. That's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, thanks, Aide. I'm looking at the Q&A, and we do have two questions that I think follow up on exactly this kind of problematic right there from Sadia Tijania. I apologize if I mispronounce your name, and Peter Matt. So they're asking about how can we resolve greenhouse gas emissions from agricultural activities, considering the global food demand keeps rising due to increased population. And another question from Peter: the war in Ukraine has demonstrated how unprepared Europe and the West in general is to transition away from fossil fuel. How can policymakers be persuaded to dedicate more resources to decarbonizing quickly rather than maintaining or increasing business as usual? So we kind of can see those two related but different issues, but all edging upon carbon, right? Bill, go ahead. Thank you.
I could speak to the other one. I mean, I could do a little bit on ag, but I'll defer on that one. But you know, the war in Ukraine is obviously you know, a signal in this process. I mean, people were looking at COVID and the implications. I mean, one of the big things from COVID and the lockdowns that occurred, you know, early on, particularly 2020, was this idea of like the potential for rapid change and incorporation of new realities and the implications that might have for climate change. And you know, it was seen as a potential opportunity. And of course, we saw immediate reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, although they've of course bounced back, you know, rapidly and have spiked actually since. And then, you know, in some ways, the same kind of narrative comes up with Ukraine. I don't have an easy answer. The question, the person writing the question, of course, is correct. I mean, you know, Western Europe, Europe in general, Central Europe, Eastern Europe, whatever, is making a transition, you know, and they're probably some of the more aggressive in terms of energy transitions globally, but still it's, you know, relatively minor. You know, I think if you look at it half full or half empty, half full, maybe. So there's, you know, some commentators sort of illustrating that maybe this provides an additional signal, additional pressure to make those energy transitions, because obviously Europe was banking on the idea that it could get a lot of its carbon emissions down by using, you know, quote unquote lower carbon, you know, natural gas from Russia. That was sort of a bargain that you know, didn't pay out geopolitically at the moment, but also didn't really pay out, you know, in terms of creating fixed assets, you know, a lot of natural gas infrastructure that you have to then transition. So it was like a short-term win. So now there's the question, you know, can they accelerate the process to sort of go to alternatives? Obviously, there's some of that present, but you know, it's really challenging to make that kind of pivot. So I don't have an easy answer, but I think that it's at least brought up the question again that, you know, the dependency on fossil fuel and the issues of political instability, that, you know, obviously a lot of alternative fuel production is more locally generated, and maybe those are, you know, strategic, you know, on the strategic side, advantages to do that, you know, if it's wind or solar or tidal or whatever. So I think I think we should look closely at the case of what Ukraine war has revealed and hopefully look for opportunities from it.
Do others want to add to it?
I could tackle that question on food demand. And that's a great question to think through. You know, I think there are a good number of examples of really effective innovations within agriculture. A lot of this has to do with moving away from industrial forms of agriculture. And so you're seeing a lot of, at least I think, a growing attention to not necessarily just small scale agriculture, but alternative forms of agriculture that uses less chemicals, that is kind of, also more oriented towards local food markets. You're seeing that in the United States as well, with community supported forms of agriculture. There's of course a lot of challenges with that, particularly in terms of thinking about ways in which you can scale these initiatives up. But there's a lot of work going on around that. But there's another point though that I want to raise, that, and I think this is a very important point, because we need to decouple the discussion around population growth from GHG emissions, right? Because while it is valid, I mean, what we're seeing, particularly over the past century, specifically in the second half of the 20th century coming up, is that the issue isn't necessarily with increased population size, but with consumption patterns. It's affluence in many ways that is driving up GHG emissions, and not necessarily population increase. And I think we need to be mindful of that actually the bulk of GHG emissions are really being generated from a handful of people. And so it's really something that, especially from the global north perspective, we have to really think about, the ways in which our consumption patterns are a big part of that problem.
Thank you, Kibon. Ade, did you want to add anything?
I agree totally.
Yes,
I don't think
and
it has to do with population growth as much as consumption. Absolutely. I mean, one of the students yesterday in this class, which is it's a 100 level class, brought up this whole issue of Ukraine, very similar to what Peter stated, and we had a bit of a discussion about what other possibilities could there have been. Could our government, the government of this country, is there an alternative to what President Biden is doing? And so I said, yeah, something has to give. People have to stop driving cars. I mean, consumption has to give. And that's what I thought at the moment, because in this moment, indeed, Ukraine is a problem. It's an issue that we all have to also think about and consider.
yes.
So, no, nothing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I don't know if statistics changed right now, but basically the United States making up less than 5% of world population at this point. I think it's dropping now. It's probably like 3% of world population. Until recently has contributed 1/5 of all carbon emissions, right? So that is kind of huge disparity. I think now this share dropped a little bit, but I don't think it is because of the decrease in absolute carbon emissions. It is because some other parts of the world are catching up and increasing their share. So that is very important issue that absolutely needs to be factored. And also when we are considering cumulative emissions, right, the ones that did occur since the beginning of industrialization. So the responsibility of what we are trying to deal with now is with the countries that have been industrializing, right, that today are wealthy countries. And they disproportionately have contributed to the current state of and speed of climate warming. And on the other side, I also wanted to mention that according to some estimates, world population is not, well, first of all, we know that it's stabilizing, right? But according to some researchers, that it is actually going to be decreasing. And the concern soon will not be baby boom, but baby bust. another consideration here is that the amount of food that we produce as humanity is well enough to feed everyone, right? So it's not because we don't have enough food, we have more than enough and we waste a lot of it. It is the question of justice, right? And access to food and distribution. And this is something that is amazing we still don't think of as humanity, as international community. Sorry. Go ahead. You have your hand raised.
Are you calling on me?
Oh, your hand is raised.
Yes, indeed,
Okay.
because I thought that if there is no other question pressing from the audience, I think, and hopefully everybody will profit from this, but I have a pressing question to my colleagues in here and to whoever wants to contribute.
We have one more question. I'm sorry, we have one more question from the audience.
Oh, okay,
So,
sorry.
And then we will move on to
Sure.
yours, okay?
Yeah.
So we have a question from Altenai Scott James, who asks, what do you think about the growing relationship within the Caribbean and China when it relates to climate change? Is it a relationship that will be beneficial or not?
Right. I think that's an open question with an open answer. I mean, it's kind of hard to know what that's going to look like. Certainly, you're seeing this kind of increased Sino-Caribbean relationship emerging. Certainly, China is emerging as a major kind of political actor within the region. And it's not something that has been happening. It's been happening for, I would say, certainly over the past decade or so. But as it relates to climate change, it's kind of hard to really give a solid answer to that type of question, because I still think there's a lot of things that's happening that is still kind of, it's hard to know where that relationship is going to go. Certainly there's been a lot of discussion around coal, and I think that would be kind of a troubling kind of topic to think about, right? Certainly, China is a major producer of coal. They have that as a major kind of energy security interest. And certainly in terms of the way in which they're seeing the Caribbean as a gateway to North America and Latin America will have implications for, where that relationship go in terms of concerns around energy security and climate change. But at this moment, it's kind of hard to tell what that's going to look like. And I don't really want to make an assumption, right? It's like, I think these things are extremely dynamic. And the kind of relationship that China has with different Caribbean states is also shaped by its global kind of emergence as this economic power as well, and the kind of tensions that they're facing as it relates to their kind of broader contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. So I think it's really kind of difficult at this point, but it's one thing I can say is that their presence in the Caribbean has definitely increased over the past decade or so. And I don't think it's going anywhere anytime soon. It's going to really be kind of interesting to see where that goes in terms of, their influence in the region and how that kind of ties into broader kind of geopolitics, global geopolitics.
Kevin, it has increased all over South America.
Yeah,
absolutely, incredibly, so much. It's in this moment, a worrisome trend is that in some ways they are dominating certain debates, and in some strong political sectors, they seem to be believing everything that Putin says. And I don't think it's direct Russia connection, but mostly through China's role in South America.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, yes. I have lots to say about it, but I'm not going to say anything. Just can't really. But Ida, why don't you please ask your question, because I just want to say that we have 8 minutes left,
Thank
so
you.
it would be a great way to finish it.
Right. My question was mostly trying to elicit comments from you people here, which relates a little bit to Peter's question. I mean, how do we convince, I mean, he put it in terms of convincing policymakers of one specific thing. What I ponder constantly, struggle constantly with, is how to make this connection from these wonderful reports written by very respected, esteemed colleagues that I trust, believe in. What is our role? Well, I mean, how do we get people to understand that we're connected? I mean, as Bill was presenting this report, I could imagine now starting to concoct feedbacks to teach in class and include this and that. But how do we, what's our role? I mean, here we seem to be all enlightened, and we seem all to be enlightened and at least convinced that there is an urgency. And I am sure that maybe I made it more vocally personal, but I have no doubt that you all feel this personal urgency to contribute to this change. We need to get more people into it. So how do we do that?
Bill, do you want to say something? And you also are one of the people who talks about opportunities. So I'm curious what your view would be.
Well, I guess, obviously I don't have any magic answer, but, I think the issues that I think your question raises, I mean, certainly is the question of youth and the youth movements globally, awareness of this issue. And I think what you're starting to see is an imperative for change among young people, and not just, and the other sort of slice of the opportunity, is connected to this like climate resilient development, which has certainly some baggage, but the recognition that if we're going to address climate change, we really have to address underlying questions of inequity, which is circling back to a central point here, and justice, and reconnecting to questions of sustainable development, which have sort of in some ways been lost in the last 10 years or so. And that we need to sort of connect it with everyday life and the experience that people have, and these sort of underlying issues. We can't silo climate change as a separate thing. And I think the youth of the world, get that message, and so that's sort of the ray of hope that I see in this process.
Thank you. Kimon, go ahead.
Yeah, and I could speak to that. I mean, from the Caribbean perspective, there is the Caribbean Youth and Environment Network, CYEN. There's a whole range of youth groups that's really very active in these climate debates and so on. I think the Caribbean serves as a good example of how the science can inform advocacy. One of the things that I've seen with climate scientists like Michael Taylor and his kind of climate studies group is that they were essential in providing the support for the Caribbean to mount their 1.5 to Stay Alive campaign. So the science was used as a way of providing evidence, or at least some form of scientific basis for pushing for 1.5C. And I've seen, that in terms of even Michael Taylor's work being very important in terms of the special report as well. He was a part of that, and he brought me in to the SR 1.5C because of course of his kind of awareness of the type of work that I do. But on top of that, one of the things I've also seen, and this ties into what Bill mentioned about how do we make sense of this in terms of our everyday realities, is the work that artists are doing, like not just scientists, but it's like, I ended the presentation with that image of the 1.5C. And these are ways in which other actors are coming to play, not just in terms of science, but the humanities, in terms of the arts, where people are like making poems and singing about this, and bringing in like traditional knowledge and so on for people to be able to understand something that has often been framed as an abstract, something that is out there, something that is to come, to kind of make people realize that it is happening here. And the kind of way in which I kind of think about this is, and I've seen this a few years ago, it's like you're driving a car and you can only see a certain distance ahead of you. For you to know which directions to go, you always have to be looking in front, but also behind, right? To kind of inform you of where you're going. And I think the ways in which we're seeing traditional knowledge coming into play, backing up that with climate science and through advocacy, is a way in which we're thinking about the future, but also kind of thinking about the present and the past almost at the same time. And I think that has a lot to do with not just the science, but also like really drawing on existing knowledges and being very attuned to cultural traditions and so on, where people are already, like, people know about these changes, they're experiencing it, but they want to be able to explain it in their own terms. And once you can empower people that way, they can be really effective change agents and advocates.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. This also made me think about that we need a map, like when we drive, we really need a map at this point to really kind of go to the place that scientists tell us to go. I just want to finish here with the comment that Natalie Monderosa wrote. So given our, who is an adjunct instructor in our department, given our human traits, our propensity for water, for attention, for understanding, where do we go from here, all species that we know of seek longevity, we all live together on this rock. How do we come together in the fight for the survival of the human species? So that seems to be today the issue which is so tangible. It used to be like a big thing in general in case alien civilizations are going to invade or something. But I think today it really becomes the question of everyday reality. So I'm conscious about time. It is 6:30 in the evening. Thank you everyone who stuck with us. I think it was amazing conversation. I'm so grateful to my colleagues, Aide and Bill. I'm so grateful to Kivon for being with us here tonight. And let's keep those conversations going and find the ways to translate them into action, because the window still exists, but it's closing fast, right? So this is my concern. I'm thinking about its closing, not kind of existing. So let's move forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.